Hi everyone, David Fazzino here, and welcome to part one of our screencast on poverty and wealth for Anthropology and World Problems being offered through Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania. In part one, I'll go through the overview and history of economic thought that really informs a lot of the discussions around the politics and economics of decisions which are made in terms of larger economic contexts, which will have real world ramifications as we'll explore in parts 1 and 2. So some of the big questions overall that we're getting at here is, how do we define poverty? How do we define wealth? Should there be any limits to either one of these, limits to poverty or limits to wealth? And what are the potential actions that can be taken in order to ensure distribution? We talked earlier about some of the different mechanisms from our section on economic anthropology in terms of redistribution within society. We also will highlight some of this in the discussion of food security, and at the very end of the screencast for this particular class, we'll be looking at Alf Hornberg's suggestion on redistribution using a coupon or local exchange trading system. So what are the potential implications of these efforts at redistribution? And certainly we're seeing some of the implications of this and discussing this during the current state of the economy, both globally and in the United States. So part one is going to take a look at the history of economic thought. We'll look at some of the work pre-Adam Smith, the work of Adam Smith, and then Marx and Weber. And from there, we'll shift to part two, looking at measures of wealth and poverty from the Human Development Index. We'll look at income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. We'll look at things like absolute and relative deprivation, abject poverty below the $1.90 a day line. We'll look at the impacts of COVID-19 on dealing with abject poverty, or the international poverty line, again at $1.90 per day. And then we'll also look at wealth aggregation and how this has occurred in the United States, as the particular example that we'll draw from here. The final section or part of the unit on poverty and wealth, we'll be looking at some different ethnographic examples, highlighting debt at the national and household level. We'll look at the impacts of neoliberalism as a macroeconomic policy. We'll look at irony and humor as a social commentary against billionaires, or sort of playing with this idea of billionaires. And we'll look at the Occupy movement, which really called on the 99%, and looked at things like wealth aggregation at the 1%, and how anthropologists have written about these things. So let's get started with part one. Again, this is an overview and history of economic thought. So pre-Smith, you had a number of individuals who were making these commentaries about economic life. And remember from our earlier section, we talked about economics as a way of making a living. And the early pre-Smith individuals included Aristotle, Plato, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Agriculture was viewed as a source of wealth in that it provides necessities. The economy is associated with a social unit, and particularly the household, the origins of the word economy, and that individuals and households in terms of management, household management, must exercise prudence and wisdom. The love of money is the root of all evil, as an end in and of itself. Money is dirty. Money is excrement. Production for use value is looked at as legitimate. However, production for non-use value would be not necessarily thought that way. In the classical and traditional societies, these are built on hierarchy and the supposed intrinsic differences. Humans are not all equal, but are all children of God. And so here you have the so-called great chain of being, and this supposedly divinely ordained hierarchy for basically the entire planet, right? And even the supernatural world as well. So the idea that gods would sit at the top, and then you would have the archangels and the angels, and then humans between the spirit and the flesh, and then humans are all equal, or they're not all viewed necessarily as equal, but they're all children of God. And of course, this ties into some larger ethnocentric discussions that supposedly justify dispossession of indigenous peoples by settler societies. Distribution and exchange must be regulated by concepts of justice. So again, what constitutes justice? And again, we see the cultural underpinnings of how justice or equality is defined. And of course, we'll get into that with this discussion, particularly of economics and wealth distribution. So Adam Smith, probably better than no one else, embodies this idea of capitalism, at least how we think about it. And the book, the compendium, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776, or just simply The Wealth of Nations, was a compilation of the work of previous scholars that we just discussed, Aristotle, Plato, St. Thomas Aquinas, and others. But it was also the codification of capitalism, so this writing down all in one place. So like many different scholars, Adam Smith weaves together these varying thoughts and ideas and becomes recognized, as we look back into history, as the individual that is most closely associated with this idea of capitalism. So he pioneered the idea of political economy, the relationship between the political state and the economy as a whole. And of course, these are deeply tied with one another. If you think about the idea of the government not being involved in aspects of the economy, I think we would see very quickly with these that there would not be necessarily order in terms of how the economy would work. So weights and measures, for example, standardization, purity standards, currency, all of these things, even things like transportation, safety of transportation, the Interstate Commerce Clause in the United States, which covers all of these different exchanges, and then antitrust legislation as well. So all of these things come into play. We can also think about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and think about the regulation of meatpacking plants and other food processing facilities that sometimes work, but of course we also see quite a bit in terms of food recalls still today. And that's also a product of industrialized food production overall and centralization. The concept here was a utilitarian concept that we talked about in other settings, so in looking at the environment as a whole. We'll talk about this in the context of Gifford Pinchot's idea of utilitarianism, or the greatest good for the greatest number. So the moral implications of the system, essentially capitalism would have impacts, but the benefits would outweigh the costs. So there would be winners and losers, but ultimately there would be more winning than losing. Adam Smith called on what he referred to as the invisible hand of market. He's very much associated with this. Ayn Rand picks this up later on. The market to transform selfish ambition into the greatest good. The conservatives at the time relied on the heavy hand of regulations on commerce, while liberals follow Smith's advice about the markets. And again, these roles reverse over time. So Smith, again, associated with neoclassical economics and capitalism. Francis Kinsey's treatise on tableau of the economy, the economy as a whole, he's a physiocrat. So essentially the rule of nature. And again, pre-Smith here, but that the physiocrats basically view all value in nature. The economic system is a system in which things flow for the goods, flow of income and goods within the system overall. John Locke, Two Treatises on Government, and again, this longer title here, but we generally know it as Two Treatises on Government from 1689. The ideology of individualism that is linked to the material world, and that human nature allowed men to be selfish, but generally people acted in reasonable and tolerant manner. He draws from Hobbes's work on the social contract for the existence of the state for the benefit of the people overall. And Unlike earlier works in the economy overall, agriculture is not a source of wealth in and of itself, or it's not nature in itself, but it's the transformative capacity of human beings. And so this is the labor theory of value from John Locke. And of course, we'll see this come into play in just a little bit. Bernard de Mandeville, Naves Turns Honest, The Grumbling Hive in 1705. Is a poem where the beehive basically serves as a mirror of human society. And just like the beehive, supposedly, everyone's looking out for their own motivations and their own interests, but ultimately it serves, in other words, everybody has their role to fulfill, and ultimately it serves society as a whole, according to de Mandeville. And again, this idea coming from, coming out of Adam Smith. So Smith draws from Mandeville, Quesnay, and he brings this together in a way and presents it to the world. Marx enters into conversations essentially with Adam Smith. Of course, they're not contemporaries. And Marx has written extensively about a number of issues, particularly the impacts of capitalism. And of course, the time period within which Marx was living was one marked by severe economic transitions that had implications in terms of human health and well-being. And he was witnessing this firsthand. And this, if we remember back from our discussion of capitalism in our section on social inequality, workers, according to Marx, were required to sell their labor because it's the only thing they had. They had lost control of the means of production. And so this idea of class and this idea of class conflict for Marx become incredibly essential. He calls for a manifesto of the Communist Party, essentially to unite the workers of the world who were by no means united during the time period. And that is what Marx and Engels are specifically addressing in the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Capital, Critique of Political Economy in 1867. And then Marx's general contribution to economic anthropology is helping to understand human nature, history, and economics holistically. And so these provide some concrete tools for Western social science and thinking about the economy and thinking about the infrastructure of the economy and the superstructure of the economy as well. So just like Marx enters into conversations with Adam Smith about capitalism, so too does Max Weber enter into conversations with Karl Marx about capitalism. And for Marx, class was a key or central concept. In Max Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, written between 1904 and 1905, basically looks at the underpinnings and ideology of accumulation of wealth. And The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber focuses an analysis on the Calvinist, who would acquire wealth for the sake of wealth in and of itself, because wealth was an indicator of essentially being in God's good graces. So this was this idea that one was truly blessed by just simply accumulating wealth. And so this spins out in more recent manifestation, does God want you to be rich, on the cover of Time magazine. In his Economy and Society, he looks at class, status, and party. He insists that individual identity is not subsumed by class identity. And in conversation with Marx, again, this conversation with as scholars or those of the pen, he believed that Marx relied too heavily on economics and the conflict between the forces of production and relations of production as the motor driving social evolution. And Weber thinks this is overstated. Weber focused on the ownership of property as a constitutive element of class. I hope to have provided you with this discussion primarily of Adam Smith and his predecessors, Karl Marx and Max Weber, a discussion of the early underpinnings of the capitalist system and how the economy is conceptualized today, how we think about wealth, how we think about poverty, and some of the broader implications that this has in particular cultural contexts and in society across the globe as we see an increase in globalization.